So we've been discussing Boundaries for Your Soul, which is a book by Allison Cook and Kimberly Miller. And today we're going to talk about the part two of, which is step four, part two of step four. So we're on step four, and we're on the steps of how do we take an overwhelming emotion and have it not overwhelm us, but actually use it to help us become even more spiritually and emotionally mature. And so step four in this process is what we call unburdening. And so the idea is that there are parts of us that are burdened. Some of these parts of ourselves are working too hard. Some of these parts of us are hurt in some way or vulnerable. And one of the questions we ought to want to ask in terms of unburdening is, what can I learn about this hurting part of myself? Is this part carrying any burdens or feeling? And when I talk about feeling, I'm talking about feelings like anger or sadness or something like that. Is this part of me carrying a thought or an image or a physical symptom? And you might be asking, what are you talking about? Well, the only way I can do this is just to give an example of myself. A few months ago, I found a pornographic flyer in my yard. And as it turns out, as I reflected on that experience, and I realized that the first time that this happened to me, I was too young to even understand what it was that I had picked up off the ground. I had to make sense of that thing by myself because I was by myself at the time when I was a young kid. And there was feelings of secrecy, that this was something I never knew anything about, and I needed to keep it a secret because no one had ever talked about this before, so how could I talk to anybody about it? And also feelings of shame. And this sense that I have to figure this out on my own. And so I'm kind of answering these questions. So this is what I learned about the hurting part of me. It was carrying burdens and feelings, the ones I just shared with you. And then the thought that I have to figure this out on my own. And then what images came up for me was just any image of anything in the woods or on the ground that's a piece of paper sort of reminds me of that day when I was, less than 10 years old when this first happened to me. So even the image of something on the ground like that, but also obviously the images that I saw on the flyer, I don't remember all of them, but I remember maybe one of them from when I was a kid. And so that image kind of stuck and seared in my memory. What is a physical symptom? Well, for me, it might be the exhilaration of seeing something new when I was a young kid, but also that thing in the pit of my stomach, that yucky feeling, because it was something that I kind of thought maybe I shouldn't be looking at the time. In terms of unburdening, we need to pay attention. And I would call that part of me when I was younger, what we call it an exile. It's a part of me that I haven't wanted to think about ever since it happened, right? So I sort of exiled that part of me as a young man into a place where I don't think about it often until something brings it up. And when you pay attention to an exile like that, you may at first be flooded with an emotion. The idea of getting flooded with an emotion or overwhelmed. Simply ask that part of you not to overwhelm you. And usually that part of you will be relieved that you're taking the lead, and it will become calm. And for those of us who are Christians, we realize that we have the Holy Spirit of God in us. And so it's our spirit-led self that needs to take over here and tell that part not to overwhelm us. It's kind of like a child taking cues from an adult. That's what needs to happen here. So was I flooded with emotion a few months ago when I saw that piece of paper on the ground? Yes, I was. I didn't think to ask that part not to overwhelm me, and so it spent most of the day overwhelming me. I didn't find my adult self, I didn't find my spirit-led self until later in the day, and so I wasted part of that day. There are some common fears that the vulnerable parts of us have, or the exiles have, and here they are. No one will remember all the pain I've experienced. If I unburden a part of me that's been burdened since childhood, I might have this idea that no one will remember all this pain I've experienced all this time. I might have a fear that I'm not worthy to unburden this part of me. I may have a fear of abandonment, that if I unburden myself, I'm somehow going to be abandoned by other people. Or the fear of actually becoming well, because maybe we've lived all of our lives a certain way, and becoming well is actually threatening to us. And for some, it may be the fear that my memory of a loved one will fade. So we have loved ones, and to unburden ourselves of that pain that we carry that has to do with our loved ones, we may feel like the memory of that loved one will fade. For me, it was fear that people will think I'm weak because I let this piece of paper bother me a few months ago, or the idea that I struggled. I threw it in the trash, but later thought about going back in the trash and get it. And this idea that I can't tell anybody about this, I can't talk about this. And I've kind of broken that now by sharing it with all of you, right? So what we want to do is to use our imagination. Unburdening can happen when we envision a situation or through re-scripting of a belief. So here are some ways that can work. If you have shame, you can put that shame in a bottle and give it to God. You can shed your past hurt like it's a layer of clothing. You can allow your burdens to be purified by the refining fire of God. You can release them to be washed away by rain. Or you can take that wheelbarrow full of guilt to the cross of Christ and dump it there. And so for me, in the situation I've been talking about, when I entered into God's sanctuary, and this is what happened at the end of the day, I begin to think about God. I begin to think about the temple or the tabernacle of God where the Jewish people used to worship. And when I came to that place and I thought of and gazed at God's beauty and to realize that all beauty comes from God, it's like he took that burden as I walked into the sanctuary. He just pulled that burden right off of me. The beauty of unburdening ourselves is that we have plenty of imagery to use. The Bible gives us all kinds of imagery about who God is and what God does in our lives. And we can use any one of those pieces of imagery to help us unburden these vulnerable parts of us, or these parts of us that are working way harder than they should. And what I would encourage you to do is to ask for what you want. What gift would you like to receive from God in order to be made whole in this particular situation that you have in front of you? Maybe you need to choose one of the fruits of the Spirit and say, God, in place of this burden that I've been carrying, give me love, joy, peace, patience, temperance. Give me one of the fruits of your Spirit in place of this burden. I will exchange this burden for a fruit of the Spirit. Or you could ask for calmness in the situation. You could ask God to help you to be more caring about yourself. You could ask God for confidence. I was speaking to someone today and they said that they've had a spark of creativity, which is great. Or ask for courageousness, or ask for clarity. These are what we call the C's. Ask for any one of these C's and God will give them to you. You could also ask the burden part of you what it needs. Parts almost always know what they need. And for me that day, what I was looking for was a connection. And I thought maybe I could get that connection from a piece of paper, a person that was on that piece of paper. It turns out that wasn't going to be a good connection for me. I threw it out. And what I needed most was to know that I have a connection. It turns out at the end of the day, I realized that I'm connected with God, and that's all that really matters. And I spoke to my wife about this and connected with her. And so I was able to get that thing that I thought I was missing and unburden that part of me. The beautiful thing is that God gives us a new name. If we come to Jesus and we recognize what he's done for us on the cross, it says that God gives us a new name. So name your part differently now. Okay, I'm not a confused child anymore. I might have been a confused child when I was 10 years old, but today I'm an empowered child of God, and I worship the Creator. I don't worship created things. And that's why I had to throw that piece of paper into the recycle bin, right? Because I worship the Creator, not created things. And so the idea is that God's kingdom is now reigning over this part. We want God's kingdom to reign over this part. And when he does, we will realize that we have done that process of unburdening when God begins to reign there. And well, what does this process look like? This is what it looks like. You have a situation that evokes strong emotion. What you want to do at that point is to describe the feeling. Okay? For me, I was excited, but I was also sick to my stomach. Okay? And so I say, I am confused, I'm scared, and I'm feeling drawn to something in this situation. So I'm describing what I'm feeling and saying, I am these things. And then I let the circumstances fade. Okay, I let that piece of paper that I found on my driveway fade, and I focus on the feeling. The feeling is that I'm drawn to something, but also that I want to be connected to something, and I feel unconnected right now. Now, the next question I ask is, how do I feel toward this part of me that wants to jump in the recycle bin and get that piece of paper? Well, I hate that part of me that wants to do that. And I have to be honest, and I'm honest about it. That's how I feel toward that part. Now, the process is, if I feel anything other than curiosity or compassion for that part that wants to jump into the recycle bin, then I ask that new part to sit back so that I can work with the original part, okay? So there's a part of me that hates this other part. I have to ask that part that hates it to just sit back for a moment so I can understand what's going on with this original part, okay? So here's how the process unfolds. How present can I be with the original feeling, the feeling of being drawn to something, that feeling of wanting connection and feeling like you don't have it? How present can I be with that original feeling without being overwhelmed? Well, as it turns out, on that particular day, I could not be very present with that feeling at all. Now, what is the extreme belief or feeling that burdens this part of me? And for me, the answer was, I have to do this all by myself. I figured that day I had to do whatever I had to do, and I had to do it all by myself, that no one was going to help me. Okay. Now, does this part have any fears about giving up those burdens, this burden that I have to do it all by myself? Well, yes. I thought if I let someone help me, it might not work, and then I'll be stuck here. If someone else can't help me, I can't help myself, and someone else can't help me, then I'm going to be stuck here, right? Now, the next question is, how does this part want to give those burdens to God? And the answer for me that day, at the end of the day, was prayer, as I began to pray about it. But also then I began to talk to others about it, starting with my wife, I believe, or a good friend of mine. I can't remember who I told first. I think I told my wife first, right? And that was part of me unburdening myself about this. Now the next question is, what gift might God have for this part of me in return? I'm giving up the burden of this feeling like I need to do it all myself. What gift might God have for that part of me? Well, it turns out the gift I received was peace, and what I received was a connection with God in return for giving up this burden. The last thing I want to say before we finish today is Matthew 11, verses 28 through 30, which say basically that Jesus won't lay anything heavy or ill-fitting on you. Keep company with Jesus. He says, keep company with me, and you'll learn to live freely and lightly. This is the idea. Other translations would say that Jesus' yoke is light, and his yoke is easy, and his yoke is light, and his burden is light. And so when we come to Jesus, we realize that he's going to help us unburden these parts of us that feel so burdened for whatever reason. I want to thank you for joining us today. I've been encouraging people to check out this movie called The Inside Out movie by Disney Pixar, because it really explains this idea of internal family systems that we've been discussing for these past weeks. Also, there's a book called Boundaries for Your Soul by Allison Cook and Kimberly Miller. Also a great primer for internal family systems. If you'd like to join us live for these discussions, you can go to meetup.com/check your compass. Next session, we're going to get into step number 5, which is helping integrate all these parts. How do we take all these different parts of us and have them work together as a team? So instead of pulling us apart, it pulls us together and helps us emotionally and spiritually.